Hello, my name is Dr. Jeanne Whitten, and I'm Superintendent of Schools here in Methuen. And this is our TV program called Let's Talk Education. It is the fifth and final program of the 2010 academic school year. Today, I have as a guest Mr. Glenn Fratto, who is the Business Administrator for the Methuen Public Schools. And I've invited him today to share a little bit with us about building the budget in the Methuen Public Schools. So, Mr. Fratto, would you share with the community how you approach budget building from its beginnings?
Well, it's not just how I approach it, it's how most financial administrators approach the budget process. But it's a little bit different when you're talking about the public sector than in the private sector or a household budget. Because the most critical factor is how much available revenue will we have. And frankly, as we'll get into later, we still don't know what our available revenue will be for fiscal year 2011. But as we try to determine what's important and what's not important, the school committee directed us to meet at every school. So we had public hearings at every one of the grammar schools and the high school. There were school committee members, administrators, faculty members, and in some cases students participated, and some very active parents. So we actually got a feel for what was important to them, and that gave us a good feel where to start the budget process. From there, we put together something called a maintenance of staffing and services budget. What that was how much would it cost us to continue all current staffing and all current programs next year. When that came out, we had a number that was $1.5 million more than what we anticipated we would be getting in revenue from the state and the city government. And that's where we started, and the school committee said, give us options on how to reduce the budget by that amount.
So from then, I know you and I met many times with our leadership team, especially with our principals, to determine what they actually needed to run their schools relative to materials, supplies, contracted services. We met many times with Mr. Stella to find out, in fact, what we needed in terms of energy costs, repairs to our buildings. You know, we have new buildings, we want to keep them in good shape, so we have to do, you know, the annual repairs. But we also had to look at our staffing, because that's where our numbers seem to come in very high.
As you know, Superintendent, the largest single figure in our budget is salaries. 81% of our operating budget is salaries. That doesn't include the cost for insurances, et cetera, just because that's paid for by the city and charged back to us. But 81% of our operating budget of almost $70 million is salaries. Throughout the year, we were charged by the school committee to provide savings, not only for fiscal year 11, but for fiscal year 10. And we worked with vendors, we worked with contractors, we renegotiated contracts. We've made significant efforts to reduce utilization of energy at the facilities.
Yes.
That have resulted in hundreds of thousands of dollars of savings this year, which we'll carry into next year, and we're going to even challenge ourselves to reduce those expenses by even more. But the bottom line is, even after all of the reductions in force that occurred this year in many, many areas, there's still a number that we had to reduce. Unfortunately, as we prepared to do our final proposed budget to the school committee, the deficit grew from 1.5 million to 1.84 million. How did that happen? Well, our original budget was based on the governor's proposal back in January, and he proposed a certain number of Chapter 70 for the school department. We met in February with our legislators, who assured us that by March we would have a final number to build our budget on. Well, here we are, June 15th. Yes. We still don't have a number.
So we still don't have a clear number coming out of the legislature?
No. And the fact is, whether people realize it or not, is the school committee doesn't decide how much we spend. The city council doesn't even decide how much we spend. The state legislature comes up with a calculation of how much it will cost to educate a child in Methuen next year. They multiply that amount by what they consider our enrollment. They come up with a number. And they divide that number into two parts, Chapter 70 aid and local contribution. We still don't have that number. So we have to build a budget based on the best available information we have, and the best available information we have at this point in time is that we need to prepare a budget that reduced expenditures by 1.84 million. Unfortunately, that required a reduction in staff and it required layoffs.
And that was really a difficult situation, I think, for all of us to have to give layout notices to our staff who have worked so hard for so many years. But in fact, I don't think there were any other choices in that budget.
Well, can I give a historical perspective?
Absolutely. I think that would be helpful.
Okay, in 1993, the state enacted ed reform. And the purpose of ed reform was to ensure that every student in every school across the state was provided an adequate education. And it costs a certain amount of money, they determined, to provide an adequate education. It's different in Boston than it might be out in the western part of the state because of salaries of employees. But they came up with a figure for adequate education. They multiplied it by your enrollment, and the figure is called net school spending. And from 1994 to fiscal year 2008, the net school spending figures for Methuen provided an 11% per year budget increase.
11% increase.
11% increase per year, which was driven by 18% increase in state aid and a 6% increase in the local contribution.
Wonderful.
So up until 3 years ago, 11% budgets, double-digit budget increases allowed the school department to do pretty much what it wanted.
They truly were the golden years.
Well, since FY09, things have drastically changed. And rather than looking at double-digit increases, we're looking at 1%, 2%, 3% budget increases. And when you have contractual cost increases of significantly more than that, something's got to budge.
And that's where we are at this point in time.
That's where we are right now.
Well, how has the Chapter 78 historically benefited Methuen?
Well, the Chapter 78 is based on a community's ability to pay for the adequate education. And since 1993, according to the figures provided by the state on which they make the calculation, Methuen's two wealth factors, which they determine how much you can afford, are based on equalized property valuation and average household income. Well, over the past 17, 18 years, compared to the rest of the state, Methuen hasn't held its own. That we are ranked somewhere in the 230, 240 out of about 270 school districts. So we're not, we're considered relatively poor as far as our ability to pay. When Chapter 78 started, ed reform started, about 40% of the school budget was provided by Chapter 78. 60% was provided by the local government. Those numbers have reversed. So the amount of money that funds the school department has changed. The majority of funds are provided by the state. And we are extremely reliant. We're not as reliant as a place like Lawrence that relies on 98% for state aid. But because we rely on approximately 60% of our funding, it's important for us to know what that funding will be. And right now, we do not know. The same situation occurred last year.
Yes, last year.
And if people remember the crisis situation where the school committee couldn't approve its budget to the 3 days before the end of the last fiscal year, and the city council didn't even approve the budget to the first day of this budget year. It was because those numbers didn't come in. We were hoping to avoid that brinksmanship. Our legislators assured us that that would happen. Unfortunately, our legislators can't move the entire state legislature. Right now, based on the best information currently available, we're going to be receiving $2.2 million less than what the governor had proposed. That's why we're in the situation where we have to make cost reductions.